Hi folks, welcome to today's color process video. Okay, I'll say it right off the bat, I'm really happy with how the colors turned out for this comic. Um, I was going to go for something a bit more detailed. I probably sound like a broken record because I've been saying that a lot of late, but in this case, like I intended for the backgrounds to have more like gradients and textures and things going on, but I decided just to give it a chance and do things mostly with flats. In fact, not just mostly with flats, all with well, sorry, I am right, mostly with flats. The only thing that has a gradient to it is the sky, where I just gave that just a bit of a subtle gradient. And I have to say, yeah, it turned out a lot better than I was actually hoping for. Um, and like another thing I did here, and I had absolutely no qualms with doing it. Whereas in the previous video, I talked about how I kind of battle internally with this a lot when I'm coloring my work. But the character, I had absolutely no qualms with like not adding any shading to him whatsoever. Like I decided pretty much from the start as I was coloring this that I was going to keep him and the bin and the sign just like without any shading whatsoever, but that I would add shading to the backgrounds just to give things an almost like animated feel, like where it's like the character and the bin and the sign, they're like drawn on like a separate like cell that's put on top of like a background, like quote unquote painting. Now, one trick I learned a while back, and I don't do it a lot, but I do it every now and then when I want to save time when it comes to rendering clouds, is if you look at the original line work, you'll see that those clouds, they've got big, thick outlines. And I did those using my brush pen. And what you can then do is in Photoshop or whatever program you're using to color, you can add color to those clouds. Just a flat color, doesn't need to be a gradient or anything like that. And then obviously when you have the line work set to you lock its transparency, you can simply color in those outlines white. And what that gives you is it gives you a very convincing like kind of backlit kind of effect to the clouds, where it's like there's light coming from behind the clouds and kind of from above as well. So that color you've added to the clouds, it now looks like it's basically shadows on the clouds. And it's a really quick, simple little trick to do, and it means you don't have to spend a load of time like beautifully rendering the clouds, because there is something nice about doing the clouds that way. And where I learned to do this was in reading, what is it called? New Frontier by Tim Sale, the sadly late Tim Sale. Um, New Frontier, it's a comic he did for DC Comics, and it's like his own take on various characters from that superhero universe. And even if you're not uh, at all into superheroes and you've not read it, I would highly recommend you do. But on top of like it being a good story, the artwork is, oh, it's so good. And I mean it's Tim Sale, so of course it's good. But one thing I did take away from that comic after I read it was I was very impressed with the relative simplicity of how Mr. Sale did clouds, at least in some scenes, where it was very obvious that he uh, he rendered them in big, thick brushstrokes, and then the colorist would simply take those strokes and do what I said, where they'd add some color to the clouds and then color in those strokes with white. And it was one of those moments where after I came across that in the comic, where I was I thought to myself, how have I never thought to do this before? It's so simple, but it's so genius. Like, typically when I draw and color clouds in my comics, I tend to spend quite a bit of time with them. But in this case, I very intentionally drew the clouds that way in the comics so that I wouldn't have to spend that much time coloring them, but at the same time still have a nice looking end result. And then for the rest of the comic, like the background, it was just simply a matter of taking the various elements and duplicating, say, the leaves on the tree and the bushes in the background. I simply took that layer that I already had filled in with the base green color. I duplicated it, and then I just changed its settings to like slightly darken the color, slightly added more saturation to it, and I just added a touch of blue to the dark green, and that just gives you a very nice kind of summer spring day kind of look to the shadows. And then it was simply just a matter of like cutting out the bits of shading I didn't want, and just I'd select it with the lasso tool, then just hit backspace, and that would just delete the shadows and give me the lighting. I mean that's not all that different to how I render lighting in most of my comics, but in this case, I I didn't really worry about how realistic it looked. I just wanted to focus on how nice it looked. And I do find sometimes with my comics, I get way too worried about, what direction the light is coming from and what way the shading is going to look as a result of that direction and whatnot. And in this case, I didn't want to worry about any of that. That's maybe not an entirely good thing to, you know, kind of admit, but at the same time, sometimes you just want to sit down, do a comic, and not have to worry about that stuff. You just want to get something out there that looks quite nice. And that's another reason why I didn't add any shading to the character, because logically speaking, the way the lighting is going on with the clouds and the trees in the background, um, they look like they're backlit. So if I was adding shading to the character, I probably would have had to have him backlit as well, and have the bin backlit, and it would have gotten way too. I don't know how to describe it, but it just it I think it would have been going too far, and it would have muddied up things a bit. Like I very much wanted that character and the main elements, the character, the bit of rubbish or paper or whatever he's crumpling up, the bin, and the sign to be the main things that stand out. As I said, I wanted to almost get across like an almost like cell effect with those elements. And I went so far, like I went so far with this whole thing of like not adding lighting, of not even adding shadows beneath the sign, the character, and the bin. Like I was originally going to render in just a touch of like shading on the ground beneath them, but I felt that the line work did that already because I do have little bits of like I do have little marks under the various elements to ground them more into the scene. And I felt they did the trick. So I said, you know what? They're fine. Like, I don't need to add more shading to this scene. And as a result, I really enjoyed coloring this comic. So maybe the lesson I can learn here is, simpler is sometimes better. And like, less is more and all that. So yeah, maybe I can do a bit more of that with some future comics. See how it turns out. So yeah, thank you very much for watching, and I will talk to you at the next video. Take care.